They called me useless, sitting there behind that marble reception desk like some decorative plant they'd forgotten to water. The words still burn 3 weeks later as I sit in this coffee shop across from Henderson and Associates, watching my former colleagues shuffle through those glass doors like the walking dead they'd always been. I was a receptionist they called useless. The phrase had become my identity in that sterile 32nd floor office, whispered in boardroom corners and muttered behind printer stations. Sarah from HR would tilt her head with that practiced sympathy whenever she passed my desk, her heels clicking a funeral march across the polished marble. The partners would stride past without acknowledgement, their Italian leather shoes worth more than my monthly salary, treating me like invisible furniture that occasionally answered phones. But furniture doesn't have eyes. Furniture doesn't listen. Furniture doesn't remember every careless conversation, every unlocked computer screen, every illegal shortcut taken in the name of profit margins and deadline pressures. The morning they terminated me started like any other. I arrived at 7:30 sharp, just as I had for 2 years and 4 months. The lobby was empty except for the overnight security guard finishing his rounds, nodding at me with the same tired recognition he'd given me for over 800 consecutive mornings. I settled into my chair, the familiar squeak of cheap hydraulics greeting me like an old friend, and began the ritual of powering up the reception desk systems. The phone system hummed to life. The client database loaded with its usual reluctant wheeze. The appointment calendar flickered open, showing the day's parade of meetings, depositions, and consultations that would fill these halls with the quiet desperation of people fighting battles they couldn't win alone. Henderson and Associates specialized in corporate law, the kind of bloodless warfare fought with contracts and clauses instead of bullets. They represented mid-tier companies in employment disputes, merger negotiations, and the occasional white-collar criminal defense. Nothing glamorous, nothing that made headlines, just the steady grind of billable hours and quarterly bonuses that kept the lights on and the partners in their German luxury cars. I was 28 years old and invisible. My bachelor's degree in communications hung somewhere in my apartment closet, rolled up and forgotten like a diploma from a school that no longer existed. 2 years of law school had ended when my father's cancer treatments drained our family savings, leaving me with debt, half an education, and a receptionist position that barely covered rent on a studio apartment in Queens. But I was good at being invisible. I absorbed information like a sponge, filing away details that others forgot the moment they left their lips. I knew which partners were sleeping with which associates. I knew about the off-books retainer payments that never appeared in official records. I knew about the client poaching, the bribed city inspectors, and the convenient document shredding that happened every third Friday after normal business hours. Most importantly, I knew about the hiring practices. It started as background noise, the kind of casual conversation that happens when people assume you're not really listening. Karen Morrison, the managing partner, would discuss candidate profiles while I sat less than 10 feet away, sorting mail and answering phones. Her voice carried that particular authority that comes from never being questioned, never being challenged, never having to explain herself to anyone who mattered. Morrison had her preferences. White males from Ivy League schools got fast-tracked through interviews, their resumes tagged with colored sticky notes that indicated priority processing. Women and minorities faced additional scrutiny, their qualifications dissected with microscopic attention to perceived flaws and potential problems. I watched qualified candidates get rejected for reasons that had nothing to do with their legal expertise and everything to do with Morrison's comfort level. The paper trail was subtle but consistent. Rejection letters always cited vague concerns about cultural fit or communication style. Internal notes referenced lunch meetings and informal conversations that somehow never included diverse candidates. The whole system operated with the kind of institutional prejudice that was technically legal but morally bankrupt, designed to maintain the status quo while providing plausible deniability. I might have stayed silent forever, content to collect my meager paychecks and fade into the background. But then Morrison hired Bradley Weinstein. Weinstein was 26, fresh from Columbia Law, and spectacularly unqualified for the senior associate position they handed him. His interview lasted 15 minutes, barely enough time to discuss his golf handicap and his family's country club membership. He started the following Monday with a corner office, a secretary, and a starting salary that was 3 times what I earned after 2 years of perfect attendance and flawless performance. I watched him fumble through basic legal procedures, mispronounce client names, and delegate research work to paralegals while taking credit for their insights. His incompetence was matched only by his arrogance, a toxic combination that made him Morrison's unofficial favorite within his first month. The tipping point came on a Tuesday morning in October. Morrison had scheduled interviews for a junior associate position, and the candidates were impressive. Dr. Aisha Patel, a Harvard Law graduate with a PhD in corporate finance. Marcus Chen, Yale Law Review editor with published articles on employment discrimination. Jennifer Reyes, Stanford graduate who had clerked for a federal appeals court judge. All three were better qualified than anyone currently working at Henderson and Associates. All three were rejected within 48 hours. Morrison hired Tommy Brennan instead. 25 years old, mediocre grades from a third-tier law school, but his father owned a construction company that had worked on several of Morrison's real estate developments. The nepotism was so blatant that even the other partners seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their leather chairs during the announcement meeting and avoiding eye contact with the existing staff. That afternoon, Morrison called me into her office. The space reeked of expensive perfume and leather polish, a temple to success that felt designed to intimidate rather than impress. Her desk was clean except for a single manila folder, which she opened with theatrical precision. Performance review, she explained, though the meeting felt more like an execution. Her criticisms were vague but damning: poor attitude, lack of initiative, failure to project professional image. The specific examples she cited were laughably minor: a phone call where I'd allegedly sounded tired, a morning when my blouse had wrinkled during the commute, a lunch break that had stretched 3 minutes beyond the allotted hour. But the real message was clear in her body language, the way she delivered her verdict without looking directly at me, as if eye contact might contaminate her with whatever failure she believed I represented. I was being eliminated, removed like a stain that had become too noticeable to ignore. The termination was effective immediately. Security would escort me to my desk to collect personal belongings, then walk me to the elevator. 2 weeks severance pay, a neutral reference letter, and a non-disclosure agreement that prohibited me from discussing my employment experience with anyone. I signed the papers with steady hands, my face a mask of professional acceptance. But inside, something fundamental shifted. The invisible receptionist who had absorbed years of casual cruelty and institutional prejudice began to crystallize into something harder, more focused, infinitely more dangerous. They handed me a cardboard box and watched me pack my few personal items under security supervision. A coffee mug from my college bookstore. A small succulent plant that had somehow survived the fluorescent wasteland of the reception desk. A red stapler I'd bought with my own money because the company-issued staplers constantly jammed. The elevator ride down 30 floors felt like descending into a different world, one where Karen Morrison's authority couldn't reach me, where her carefully constructed system of discrimination couldn't touch me. But I carried something with me that she didn't know about, something more valuable than the pathetic severance check they'd pressed into my hands. I carried her secrets. 2 years and 4 months of invisible observation had given me access to information that could destroy everything Morrison had built. Not just career-damaging gossip or embarrassing personal details, but documented evidence of systematic discrimination that violated federal employment laws. Email threads discussing candidate rejections based on race and gender. Internal memos outlining strategies to avoid hiring qualified minorities. Budget allocations that showed how much more money they spent recruiting from predominantly white universities. The evidence was scattered across different systems, buried in routine communications and meeting notes that Morrison had never bothered to secure because she'd never imagined that the invisible receptionist was paying attention. But I had been paying attention, filing away details, making mental notes of file names and email timestamps that could be cross-referenced and compiled into something devastating. Standing on the sidewalk outside the building, clutching my cardboard box like a refugee carrying the remnants of a destroyed life, I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I was going to destroy Karen Morrison and Henderson and Associates, not with violence or scandal, but with the truth. Their own institutional prejudice would become the weapon I used to tear down their comfortable world of profit margins and plausible deniability. The receptionist they'd called useless was about to become their worst nightmare, but revenge requires patience, and patience requires planning. I couldn't simply march into the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission with accusations and expect them to believe me. I needed documentation, proof, a paper trail that even Morrison's expensive lawyers couldn't dismiss or discredit. I needed to build a case so overwhelming that denial would be impossible and damage control would be futile. Most importantly, I needed to remain invisible just a little longer. The first challenge was access. My employee credentials had been deactivated before the elevator reached the ground floor, cutting me off from the internal systems that contained the most damaging evidence. But institutional security is only as strong as its weakest human element, and I knew exactly where Henderson and Associates was vulnerable. Janet Holbrook had worked as the night cleaning supervisor for 6 years, arriving each evening at 10 p.m. to oversee the team that sanitized and organized the office space. She was in her 50s, a single mother putting her youngest daughter through community college, and she cleaned with the methodical thoroughness of someone who took pride in work that others considered beneath notice. More importantly, Janet liked me. During my 2 years at Henderson and Associates, I'd been one of the few employees who acknowledged her existence, offering genuine smiles and casual conversation during the overlap between day and night shifts. While my colleagues treated the cleaning staff like mobile furniture, I'd learned about Janet's daughter's academic achievements, her weekend volunteer work at a local church, and her plans to eventually start her own commercial cleaning business. I found her 3 days after my termination, waiting at the bus stop she used for her evening commute to the office. She recognized me immediately, her weathered face creasing with concern as she asked about my sudden disappearance from the reception desk. I told her the truth, or at least the part of it that mattered. Morrison had fired me for fabricated reasons, eliminating a potential witness to practices that violated federal employment law. I was building a case to expose the discrimination, but I needed access to evidence that could help other qualified candidates who had been illegally rejected. Janet listened with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades navigating workplace politics from the bottom of the hierarchy. She understood discrimination in ways that Morrison's privileged perspective could never comprehend, having faced her own battles as an older African-American woman in an industry that preferred its service workers young, invisible, and grateful for whatever scraps they were offered. But she was also pragmatic. Helping me meant risking her own job, her daughter's education, and the financial stability she'd fought decades to achieve. I couldn't ask her to sacrifice everything for my vendetta, no matter how justified. Instead, I offered her a partnership. The plan was elegantly simple. Janet's keycard provided access to the entire building, including executive offices that were cleaned and organized each night. Security cameras monitored the hallways but not individual offices, assuming that cleaning staff had legitimate reasons to be anywhere in the building. Janet could document evidence of discrimination using her own smartphone, creating a backup record that existed outside Henderson and Associates' control. In exchange, I would share any financial settlement or legal victory that resulted from exposing the discrimination. Janet would become a whistleblower under federal protection, entitled to compensation for her courage in revealing illegal practices. Her daughter's education would be secure, and she could finally escape the cycle of working for employers who treated her as expendable. But the arrangement required absolute secrecy and perfect execution. We couldn't communicate through normal channels, couldn't meet in public, couldn't leave any trace that might connect Janet to my investigation. One mistake would destroy both of our lives and hand Morrison the evidence she needed to claim harassment or industrial espionage. We developed a system based on dead drops and coded messages. Janet would leave photographed documents in a sealed plastic bag inside a particular dumpster behind a Chinese restaurant 2 blocks from the office building. I would retrieve the materials during early morning runs when the streets were empty and security camera coverage was minimal. Anything requiring immediate attention would be communicated through classified ads in the local newspaper, using language that appeared innocuous, but carried specific meanings we'd established in advance. The first batch of evidence arrived 4 days later. Janet had photographed Morrison's appointment calendar, showing the interview schedules for the past 6 months. The pattern was immediately obvious to anyone looking for it. Minority candidates were consistently scheduled during less desirable time slots, often late in the day when everyone was tired and eager to finish work. Their interviews were shorter, less thorough, with fewer follow-up meetings than their white counterparts. But appointment schedules alone wouldn't prove intentional discrimination. I needed communications that revealed Morrison's thought processes, documentation that showed her reasoning for hiring and rejection decisions. That meant gaining access to her email account and internal messaging systems. This is where my invisible years at the reception desk became invaluable. I'd watched Morrison enter her passwords countless times, observing her finger movements and the timing of her keystrokes. She used the same login credentials for multiple systems, a security violation that made her entire digital life vulnerable to someone who knew what to look for. But accessing her accounts remotely required technical expertise I didn't possess. Hiring a professional hacker was expensive and risky, potentially creating evidence of criminal activity that Morrison could use to discredit my entire case. I needed a different approach, something that leveraged the access Janet already possessed while maintaining plausible deniability. The solution came from an unexpected source, Henderson and Associates' own paranoia about digital security. Morrison had insisted on physical backups of all important communications, printed copies that were filed in locked cabinets within her office. The policy was designed to protect against cyber attacks and system failures, but it also created a paper trail that existed outside the digital security measures that protected her computer accounts. Janet could photograph these physical documents during her nightly cleaning routine, creating copies that revealed Morrison's discriminatory communications without requiring illegal computer access. The evidence would be admissible in court, obtained through legitimate means by someone who had authorized access to clean and organize the office space. The next 2 weeks produced a treasure trove of damaging material. Internal emails between Morrison and other partners discussing strategies to avoid hiring qualified minority candidates. Handwritten notes from interview meetings that included explicit racial and gender-based commentary. Budget documents showing disparities in recruiting expenditures based on the demographic profiles of target universities. But the most devastating evidence came from Morrison's personal files, a spreadsheet tracking candidate demographics and rejection ratios that proved systematic discrimination across multiple hiring cycles. The document was titled Quality Control Metrics and used coded language to disguise its discriminatory purpose, but the statistical patterns were unmistakable. Morrison had been maintaining an illegal quota system, ensuring that Henderson and Associates remained predominantly white and male despite receiving applications from highly qualified diverse candidates. The practice violated multiple federal laws and created liability that could result in millions of dollars in damages and criminal prosecution for the responsible parties. I had my smoking gun, but evidence alone wouldn't guarantee victory. Morrison had resources, connections, and experience fighting legal battles that threatened her interests. She would hire the best defense attorneys money could buy, launch counterattacks designed to discredit my credibility, and use every available strategy to minimize damage to her reputation and business. I needed to ensure that my evidence reached people who couldn't be intimidated, bought, or persuaded to look the other way. That meant going beyond the EEOC complaint process and creating public pressure that would force authorities to take aggressive action. The strategy required perfect timing and multiple angles of attack. First, I compiled the evidence into a comprehensive dossier that documented the pattern of discrimination across different hiring cycles, candidate pools, and decision-making processes. The report was over 200 pages long, including photographs of original documents, statistical analyses, and detailed timelines that showed how Morrison's illegal practices had evolved and expanded over time. I sent copies to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the New York State Division of Human Rights, and the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Each submission included affidavits from qualified candidates who had been illegally rejected, statements I'd tracked down through LinkedIn and professional networking sites. But government investigations move slowly, and Morrison would have months to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses once she learned about the complaints. I needed immediate pressure that would prevent her from implementing damage control measures. That's where the media strategy became crucial. I researched journalists who specialized in employment discrimination stories, focusing on reporters who had previously exposed similar scandals at major corporations. The New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and local television stations all had investigative teams that might be interested in a story about systematic discrimination at a corporate law firm. But journalists require verification and multiple sources before publishing allegations that could result in defamation lawsuits. I needed to provide them with evidence so compelling that editorial review would be swift and publication would be immediate. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. I would orchestrate simultaneous exposure across multiple channels, creating a media tsunami that would overwhelm Morrison's ability to respond effectively. I scheduled meetings with 3 different journalists for the same afternoon, providing each with exclusive access to different portions of the evidence. The employment discrimination reporter at the Times received the statistical analysis and budget documents. The Wall Street Journal's legal affairs correspondent got the email communications and meeting notes. The local television investigative team received the candidate testimonials and photographic evidence. Each journalist believed they were getting an exclusive story, which motivated them to work quickly to beat their competitors to publication. But the evidence was complementary rather than overlapping, creating multiple angles that would reinforce rather than contradict each other once the stories broke simultaneously. I also provided copies of everything to legal advocacy organizations that specialized in employment discrimination cases. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Equal Rights Advocates, and the American Civil Liberties Union all had resources to launch their own investigations and legal actions that would amplify the pressure on Henderson and Associates. But the masterstroke was personal. I researched every qualified candidate who had been illegally rejected by Morrison over the past 3 years, tracking down their current contact information and professional status. Dr. Aisha Patel was working as in-house counsel for a pharmaceutical company, earning significantly less than she would have made at Henderson and Associates. Marcus Chen had started his own practice, struggling to build a client base without the institutional support that Morrison's firm provided to its white male associates. Jennifer Reyes had taken a position with a public defender's office, fighting for justice on behalf of clients who couldn't afford private representation. I reached out to each of them individually, explaining what I'd discovered and offering to share evidence that proved they'd been victims of illegal discrimination. Most were initially skeptical, having assumed their rejections were based on legitimate competitive factors rather than prejudice. But the documented proof was undeniable, and their anger was proportional to their qualifications. Within days, I had recruited a class action lawsuit that included 12 highly qualified attorneys who had been illegally rejected by Henderson and Associates. Their combined legal expertise created a formidable adversarial team that Morrison couldn't dismiss or intimidate. They were suing for damages, but more importantly, they were demanding systemic changes that would prevent future discrimination. The final piece of the puzzle was timing. I needed to ensure that all these different pressures hit Morrison simultaneously before she could mount an effective defense or implement damage control measures. That meant coordinating release schedules across multiple organizations and media outlets, synchronizing everything to create maximum impact. I chose a Thursday morning in November, exactly 6 weeks after my termination. The EEOC complaint would be filed at 9 a.m. The class action lawsuit would be served at 10 a.m. The first media stories would break during the lunch news cycle, followed by evening television coverage and Friday morning newspaper articles. Morrison would wake up Thursday morning as the managing partner of a successful corporate law firm. By Friday evening, she would be the center of a national discrimination scandal that threatened to destroy everything she'd built. But I wasn't finished yet. The evidence I'd gathered revealed more than just hiring discrimination. Morrison's files contained information about client billing irregularities, tax avoidance schemes, and potential conflicts of interest that violated professional ethics rules. While employment discrimination was the primary weapon in my arsenal, these additional violations could be used to ensure that Morrison faced consequences beyond civil lawsuits and media embarrassment. I prepared supplementary complaints to the New York State Bar Association's Disciplinary Committee, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. Each focused on different aspects of Morrison's misconduct, creating multiple fronts that would require separate legal responses and drain resources that might otherwise be used to fight the discrimination charges. The Bar Association complaint was particularly devastating because it threatened Morrison's professional license. Lawyers convicted of systematic discrimination could face suspension or disbarment, effectively ending their careers regardless of how much money they had to fight civil lawsuits. Morrison might survive financial damages, but she couldn't practice law without professional certification. By Wednesday evening, everything was in place. Janet had provided the final batch of evidence, photographing Morrison's most recent hiring communications, to ensure our documentation was current and comprehensive. The journalists had completed their fact-checking and legal reviews. The lawsuit plaintiffs had signed their final agreements and coordinated their media statements. The regulatory complaints were drafted and ready for submission. I spent that last night in my studio apartment, reviewing the timeline one final time and confirming that every element was synchronized for maximum impact. The cardboard box from my termination sat in the corner, still unpacked after 6 weeks, a reminder of the humiliation that had started this entire campaign. Tomorrow, Karen Morrison would learn what happened when you dismissed someone as useless without understanding what they were capable of achieving. The first indication that my plan was working came at 10:47 a.m. Thursday morning. I was sitting in the same coffee shop where I'd begun this story, laptop open and phone charged, monitoring news websites and social media feeds for the first signs of coverage. The initial EEOC filing had been submitted on schedule, creating an official record that would be difficult for Morrison to dismiss or delay. The class action lawsuit had been served at Henderson and Associates offices, delivered by a process server who reported that Morrison had turned visibly pale while reading the first page of charges. But the real victory came when the New York Times story went live. The headline was perfect. Corporate law firm accused of systematic hiring discrimination against minorities and women. The article led with statistical evidence showing that Henderson and Associates had rejected qualified diverse candidates at rates that were statistically impossible to explain through legitimate competitive factors. Morrison was quoted extensively from her own email communications, her discriminatory language presented without editorial commentary that might allow readers to dismiss the evidence as biased interpretation. The Wall Street Journal followed 30 minutes later with a piece focused on the financial aspects of the discrimination, calculating lost earnings for rejected candidates and estimating potential damages that could reach tens of millions of dollars. The reporter had interviewed employment law experts who described Morrison's practices as textbook examples of institutional discrimination and precisely the kind of systematic exclusion that federal civil rights laws were designed to prevent. Local television coverage began during the noon news cycle, featuring interviews with several plaintiffs who described their qualifications and their bewilderment at being rejected for positions that went to less qualified white male candidates. Dr. Aisha Patel was particularly compelling, explaining how her PhD in corporate finance and Harvard Law degree had somehow been deemed insufficient for a junior associate position that was given to someone with mediocre grades from a third-tier school. By 2 p.m., the story had spread to national cable news networks. CNN ran a segment comparing Henderson and Associates to other corporate discrimination scandals, while MSNBC focused on the broader implications for workplace equality in professional services. Fox News initially tried to frame the story as an example of frivolous litigation, but even their coverage had to acknowledge the strength of the documentary evidence. Social media amplified everything. Henderson discrimination began trending on Twitter, with law students and legal professionals sharing their own experiences with biased hiring practices. LinkedIn posts from prominent attorneys condemned Morrison's actions and called for industry-wide reforms to prevent similar discrimination. The story reached audiences that traditional media couldn't touch, creating pressure from professional communities that Morrison needed to maintain her business relationships. But the most satisfying moment came at 3:15 p.m. when I received a text message from Janet. "The building is chaos," she wrote. "Partners in emergency meetings all afternoon?" Morrison locked in her office, screaming at lawyers on phone. Security blocking media from entering lobby. Staff rumors about firm closing or being sold. I walked across the street to observe the scene directly. The marble lobby that had once felt like a temple to corporate success now looked like a fortress under siege. Security guards stood at every entrance, checking identification and turning away anyone who didn't have legitimate business in the building. Through the glass walls, I could see clusters of employees huddled in conversations, their body language reflecting the uncertainty and fear that comes with working for an organization facing existential threats. Morrison's German luxury car was still in the executive parking garage, but I noticed that several other partners' vehicles were missing. The exodus had begun as senior attorneys distanced themselves from the scandal and began exploring opportunities with competitors who might offer them refuge from the legal and reputational damage. The afternoon brought even more devastating developments. The New York State Bar Association announced that it was opening a formal investigation into Morrison's professional conduct, citing credible allegations of systematic discrimination that may violate ethical obligations to promote equal access to legal services. The investigation would be public record, ensuring that potential clients and business partners would be aware of the charges, even if Morrison managed to avoid criminal prosecution. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission issued a statement confirming that it had received substantial documentary evidence of discriminatory hiring practices and would be conducting a comprehensive investigation that could result in federal civil rights charges. The statement specifically mentioned that the evidence included internal communications demonstrating intentional exclusion of qualified candidates based on race and gender. But the most damaging development was financial. Henderson and Associates' major clients began announcing that they were reviewing their legal representation arrangements, corporate speak for preparing to fire the firm, and hire replacement counsel. 2 Fortune 500 companies issued statements expressing concern about discrimination allegations and commitment to working only with legal partners who shared their values of diversity and inclusion. Stock prices for publicly traded clients dropped in after-hours trading as investors worried about potential liability exposure from their association with Henderson and Associates. The discrimination scandal was becoming a contagion that threatened every business relationship Morrison had cultivated over her career. I remained in the coffee shop until evening, watching the building across the street gradually empty as employees left for the day. The executive floors stayed lit longer than usual, suggesting emergency meetings and crisis management sessions that would continue well into the night. But the damage was already irreversible, spreading through professional networks and media channels faster than any containment strategy could manage. Friday morning brought the final wave of coverage as newspaper editorial boards weighed in on the scandal and legal experts analyzed the strength of the evidence. The consensus was unanimous. Morrison had been caught red-handed implementing systematic discrimination that violated multiple federal laws and professional ethics standards. The New York Times editorial was particularly brutal, describing Henderson and Associates as a case study in how institutional prejudice operates in supposedly meritocratic professional environments. The Wall Street Journal's editorial focused on the business implications, arguing that discrimination was not only morally wrong, but economically inefficient, as it prevented companies from hiring the most qualified candidates. But the most satisfying coverage came from legal trade publications, where Morrison's peers discussed the scandal with the insider knowledge that made their condemnation particularly damaging. The American Lawyer ran a feature article about the evidence, describing Morrison's quota system as shockingly blatant and predicting that the case would become a textbook example of how not to conduct hiring processes. Law school professors began incorporating the Henderson and Associates scandal into their employment law curricula, using Morrison's documented communications as examples of discriminatory practices that students should recognize and avoid in their own careers. The case was becoming a cautionary tale that would influence legal education for years to come. By the following Monday, Henderson and Associates was effectively finished as a functioning law firm. 3 more major clients had terminated their relationships over the weekend, taking millions of dollars in annual revenue with them. 2 senior partners had resigned and announced they were joining competing firms, bringing their client relationships and institutional knowledge to organizations that could offer them career security. The remaining staff members were updating their resumes and scheduling interviews with Henderson and Associates competitors. Morrison herself had disappeared from public view, declining interview requests and canceling scheduled court appearances. Her silence was interpreted as an admission of guilt by media commentators and legal analysts who noted that innocent parties typically defend themselves aggressively against false accusations. The class action lawsuit moved forward with devastating efficiency. 12 highly qualified attorneys working together could accomplish in days what might take individual plaintiffs months or years to achieve. They filed motions for expedited discovery, demanding access to Morrison's complete hiring records and internal communications. They subpoenaed employment data from competing firms to establish industry standards that proved Henderson and Associates' practices were uniquely discriminatory. Most importantly, they refused settlement offers that would have allowed Morrison to resolve the case quietly without admitting wrongdoing. The plaintiffs wanted public vindication, official acknowledgement that they had been victims of illegal discrimination, and systemic changes that would prevent future violations. But my favorite development was personal. Dr. Aisha Patel received job offers from 3 major corporate law firms within a week of the story breaking. Her qualifications, which Morrison had deemed insufficient, were suddenly in high demand as firms competed to demonstrate their commitment to diversity and inclusion. She eventually accepted a senior associate position with Morrison's biggest competitor at a salary significantly higher than what Henderson and Associates had been paying their white male hires. Marcus Chen was recruited by a prestigious downtown firm that specialized in employment discrimination cases, where his experience as a victim of illegal hiring practices made him particularly effective at representing other discrimination plaintiffs. His legal career, which had been damaged by Morrison's prejudice, was now stronger than it would have been if he'd been hired by Henderson and Associates originally. Jennifer Reyes left the public defender's office to join a civil rights law firm that offered her partnership track and the opportunity to fight discrimination cases like her own. The rejection that had seemed like a career setback became the foundation for a practice focused on achieving justice for other victims of workplace prejudice. All 3 of them, and the other plaintiffs in the class action lawsuit, were now more successful than they would have been if Morrison had hired them initially. Her discrimination had backfired spectacularly, elevating the careers of the people she'd tried to exclude while destroying her own professional reputation. The final chapter of my revenge played out over the following months, as various regulatory and legal proceedings reached their conclusions. The EEOC investigation confirmed systematic discrimination and imposed financial penalties that exceeded Henderson and Associates' annual profit margins. The New York State Bar Association suspended Morrison's professional license pending completion of remedial education programs that she would be required to complete before practicing law again. The class action settlement included monetary damages and a consent decree requiring independent monitoring of any future hiring practices if Morrison attempted to rebuild her career. But the most satisfying outcome was cultural. The Henderson and Associates scandal became a reference point for discussions about workplace discrimination in professional services. Law schools, business schools, and corporate training programs used the case to illustrate how institutional prejudice operates and what organizations must do to prevent similar violations. Morrison's name became synonymous with discriminatory hiring practices in legal circles. Her career, which had been built on excluding qualified candidates based on prejudice, was ended by the very people she had tried to keep out of her industry. The ultimate irony was that her own discriminatory communications had provided the evidence necessary to destroy her professional reputation. Henderson and Associates never recovered. The firm dissolved 6 months after the scandal broke, its remaining assets sold to pay legal judgments and regulatory fines. The office space was leased to a new tenant, a diversity consulting firm that specialized in helping organizations avoid the kind of discrimination that had destroyed Morrison's business. Janet received her share of the whistleblower compensation, enough money to pay for her daughter's education, and start the commercial cleaning business she'd always dreamed of owning. She was no longer dependent on employers like Morrison, who treated service workers as invisible and disposable. Instead, she built a company that provided living wages and advancement opportunities for people who had been marginalized by traditional corporate hierarchies. As for me, I used the settlement money to complete law school and establish a practice focused on employment discrimination cases. The receptionist who had been called useless became an attorney who specialized in protecting other workers from the kind of systematic prejudice I had experienced and documented. But the real victory wasn't financial or professional. It was the knowledge that Morrison's comfortable world of institutional discrimination had been permanently destroyed, replaced by accountability mechanisms that would prevent future violations. The invisible receptionist had become the architect of systemic change that protected countless future job candidates from the prejudice that had nearly derailed my own career. Every morning, I walked past the building that once housed Henderson and Associates on my way to my own law office. The marble lobby looks the same, but the power dynamics have been completely reversed. Where Morrison once wielded arbitrary authority to exclude qualified candidates, there are now legal protections and monitoring systems that ensure fair treatment regardless of race, gender, or background. The woman who had called me useless learned that usefulness isn't determined by job titles or office hierarchies. It's measured by the ability to recognize injustice, document evidence, and fight back with intelligence and determination until systematic change becomes inevitable. They called me useless. But I was the one who was still standing when the dust settled, surrounded by the ruins of their discriminatory empire and the career Morrison had spent decades building on the foundation of other people's exclusion. In the end, I wasn't useless at all. I was exactly what Morrison's world needed, an invisible witness with perfect memory, unlimited patience, and the strategic intelligence to turn their own prejudice into the weapon that destroyed them. The receptionist they had dismissed as furniture had become their judge, jury, and executioner. And justice, served cold and methodically over months of careful planning, tasted better than any revenge I could have imagined.